The screen of the phone was a cold, cruel rectangle of light in the dimming twilight of the room. It cast a sterile glow on the gnarled knuckles of the hand that held it, a hand that had built and broken, and held things far heavier than this sliver of glass and metal. The words on the screen were simple, brutally efficient in their delivery of pain. "Dinner tonight is just us. My wife doesn't want you there." A pause, as if the sender had considered the impact, and then a final, gutting addition. "It's a big night for me. I can't risk it." To the world, to the son who sent the text, to the daughter-in-law who inspired it, he was just Arthur Jensen. An old man. A widower who lived in a house that was too quiet, wearing sweaters that were a little too worn. He was a remnant of a bygone era, a silent figure in the corner at family gatherings, a man whose presence was seen not as a comfort, but as a social complication. They saw the slight limp in his gait and thought it was the simple decay of age. They saw the calloused hands and thought of his little garden, nothing more. They saw the quietness in his eyes and mistook it for emptiness. To them, he was just another old man, a ghost at the feast of their modern, successful lives. A problem to be managed. But what they didn't know, what they could never comprehend, was that the silence they found so awkward was not emptiness, but a vault. It was a cathedral of memory, built of steel and sacrifice, consecrated with a kind of honor they had never encountered. They didn't know that the limp was a receipt for another man's life, paid for on a rocky hillside thousands of miles away. They didn't know that the hands that tended roses had once assembled a bridge under the deafening roar of enemy fire, a bridge to ferry souls back from the edge of oblivion. They didn't know that the man they had just uninvited, the man they deemed a risk to their polished evening, was a quiet legend, a ghost of a different sort, whose name was still spoken in hushed, reverent tones in circles of true power, in places where courage was the only currency that mattered. This is a story about the quiet heroes who walk among us, unseen and uncelebrated. It's a story about the blindness of judging a book by its worn and faded cover. Welcome to our channel, where we believe every life holds a story worth telling. If you find yourself moved by what you see, we ask that you consider subscribing and ringing that bell, so you never miss a tale that reminds us to look deeper, to see the honor hidden in plain sight, and to understand that the greatest strengths are often the ones that never announce themselves. Now let the story unfold. Arthur read the message one more time. He didn't flinch. He didn't sigh. His face, a roadmap of years and quiet endurance, remained a placid mask. He simply pressed the button on the side of the phone, and the cruel light vanished, plunging the room back into the gentle, honest dusk. He did not reply. He never did. An argument would require him to explain, to defend, to put a price on his own worth, and that was a transaction Arthur Jensen had never been willing to make. His honor, like his grief, was a private country, with borders he alone patrolled. Arthur Jensen's life was a study in rhythm and ritual, a quiet symphony of simple things done with profound precision. His days began not with an alarm clock, but with the first, pale fingers of dawn probing the eastern sky. He would rise from his modest bed, the old springs groaning a familiar complaint, and the first thing he would do is stand for a moment before the window, watching the world awaken. His small house, nestled on a quiet, tree-lined street, was a fortress of solitude, but not of loneliness. Every object had its place, a history, a purpose. The worn armchair where his wife, Eleanor, used to read. The mantelpiece with a single, faded photograph of her, her smile still a beacon in the quiet rooms. The bookshelf filled not with grand literature, but with practical manuals on gardening, woodworking, and engine repair. These were the texts of his life now, a language of tangible reality, of soil and wood and steel. After dressing in his customary uniform of simple trousers and a soft, clean shirt, he would descend to the kitchen. The floorboards, polished by the passage of his feet over decades, creaked a welcome. The process of making coffee was a ceremony. Measuring the grounds, pouring the water, the familiar hiss and gurgle of the old percolator was the morning's first hymn. He would take his cup to the back porch, a space that was more sanctuary than structure. It overlooked his garden, a small but meticulously kept rectangle of earth that was his pride and his therapy. To an onlooker, it was just a garden, but to Arthur, it was a map of life itself. The sturdy, unyielding roots of the old oak tree at the far end, the delicate, trusting blossoms of the rose bushes Eleanor had planted, the patient, determined way the vegetables pushed through the dark soil towards the light. He would sit on the worn wooden steps, the same steps where he had taught his son, David, how to tie his shoes, and he would sip his coffee and watch. He noticed everything. The way a spider had perfectly engineered its web between two tomato stakes. The subtle shift in the wind that foretold rain. The territorial squabble of two robins over a worm. His observation was not idle. It was a deep, ingrained practice. It was the same skill that had once allowed him to spot a tripwire in the moonlight, to read the meaning of a disturbed patch of earth, to understand the silent language of a landscape that wanted him dead. The famous limp, the one his daughter-in-law Jessica found so ungainly, was a constant companion. It was a dull, rhythmic ache in his left hip, a ghost of shrapnel that doctors had said was too deep, too dangerously close to the artery to remove. He never spoke of it. When asked, which was rare, he would offer a simple, deflective answer. Old injury. The brevity was not rudeness, it was a boundary. The story of that injury was not his alone to tell. It belonged to the men who were there, to the memory of the dust and the fear, and to the young captain whose life he had carried on his back for 2 agonizing miles. In the afternoon, he often worked in his shed, a place that smelled of sawdust, oil, and time. Here his hands, which could seem so still and patient, moved with a startling, innate grace. He repaired old furniture for neighbors, fixed lawnmowers, sharpened tools. His work was flawless, his joints perfect, his engines purring back to life. People in the neighborhood knew him as the quiet, reliable Mr. Jensen, the man who could fix anything. They'd offer to pay, but he rarely accepted money. A jar of homemade jam, a fresh-baked loaf of bread, a simple thank you. That was payment enough. His needs were few. Hidden away in the back of his closet, on the top shelf, was a simple wooden box. It was not locked, but it was sealed by an unspoken covenant of memory. Inside, beneath a layer of yellowed newspaper, lay another life. A folded flag, crisp and perfect. A single, heavy challenge coin, its face worn smooth by 1,000 touches in a nervous hand. A set of dog tags, and a small, velvet-lined case containing a row of medals, including the Distinguished Service Cross, an award second only to the Medal of Honor. He had never worn them. He had never shown them to anyone, not even David. They were not trophies. They were markers, tombstones for the moments, where pieces of his soul had been spent. He lived his life now as a quiet counterpoint to the noise of his past, a deliberate choice to seek peace over praise, solitude over celebration. The world that his son and daughter-in-law inhabited, a world of status and ambition and performative success, was as foreign to him as a distant planet. He did not judge it, but he could not breathe its air. His world was one of quiet duty, of promises kept, of an honor that was not a thing to be displayed, but a thing to be lived, silently, every single day. And so, on this evening, after the text message had delivered its casual wound, Arthur did what he always did. He finished his coffee, rinsed the cup, and went to his shed. There was a neighbor's rocking chair with a loose spindle. He would fix it. He would make something whole again. It was the only way he knew how to mend the world. The world of David and Jessica Jensen was a universe away from Arthur's quiet, sun-dappled garden. It was a world of polished chrome and cool glass, of sweeping city views from a penthouse apartment that felt more like a corporate showroom than a home. It was a place where silence was not peaceful, but a void to be filled with the ambient hum of smart devices, the chatter of cable news, and the constant, anxious thrum of ambition. Jessica was the architect of this world. She was beautiful, sharp, and possessed a relentless, forward-moving energy that left little room for sentimentality or introspection. She saw life as a ladder, and every person, every event, every relationship was either a rung to help her climb or an obstacle to be navigated around. Arthur, in her carefully curated worldview, was an obstacle. He was a piece of a past she wanted David to shed, like an old, ill-fitting suit. She didn't see a quiet hero. She saw a social liability. She saw a man who didn't understand the subtle art of networking, who wore cardigans instead of bespoke jackets, who spoke of weather and gardening instead of market trends and investment portfolios. "He just brings the energy of the whole room down, David," she'd said earlier that week, her voice a carefully modulated blade of reason. They were in their gleaming kitchen, the stainless steel appliances reflecting her perfectly coiffed image. "He just sits there, smiling that sad little smile. People don't know what to say to him. It's awkward. For them, for me, for you." David, her husband, stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, staring down at the river of headlights flowing along the expressway below. He was a man caught in a crosscurrent. He loved his father, or at least, he loved the memory of the father who had taught him to ride a bike and build a model airplane. But he was also deeply in love with Jessica, and intoxicatingly so with the life she had helped him build. He was a senior vice president at a major development firm, a position he had fought for, a position Jessica constantly reminded him he needed to protect and elevate. David was the observer, the audience surrogate trapped within the conflict. A part of him, a small, quiet part that he tried to ignore, knew his father was more than what Jessica saw. He'd seen glimpses of it his whole life. The unnerving stillness his father could command. The way other men from the local VFW post, would sometimes look at his dad with a strange, profound respect that bordered on awe. He'd once seen his father, after a tree fell in a storm, assess the complex tangle of branches with a surveyor's eye, directing the cleanup with a quiet, unquestioned authority that had surprised everyone. But these were just fleeting moments, easily dismissed in the face of Jessica's powerful, present-day logic. "This dinner, David," she continued, coming to stand behind him, her hands resting on his shoulders, her voice softening into a persuasive purr. "This isn't just dinner. This is General Thompson. He's not just a CEO, he's a kingmaker. His firm is deciding on the billion-dollar waterfront contract. This is everything we've worked for. Everything needs to be perfect." David felt the familiar knot of guilt and capitulation tighten in his stomach. He was a good man, he told himself. But he was also a practical one. What was one dinner? His father was tough. He would understand. Or if he didn't, his silence would absorb the hurt, as it always did. "Okay," David had finally said, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. "Okay, Jess. I'll handle it." Handling it meant the text message. It was the coward's way out, and he knew it. Typing the words felt like a betrayal, each letter a small chip off his own soul. He outsourced the cruelty to technology, letting the cold, impersonal nature of the screen do the dirty work his voice could not. He had pictured his father reading it, the stoic set of his jaw, the way he would just absorb the blow without a word. And a part of David relied on that stoicism. He needed his father to be the uncomplaining rock, the silent shock absorber for the compromises he was making in his own life. He had built a narrative in his mind to justify it. Dad is simple. He prefers to be alone. He wouldn't enjoy this kind of stuffy corporate dinner anyway. It was a lie, a flimsy shield against a truth he didn't want to face, that he was ashamed. Ashamed of his father's simplicity, his lack of worldly status, his quiet, unadorned dignity. He was ashamed because Jessica was ashamed, and her perspective had slowly, insidiously become his own. The silence from his father after the text was sent was deafening. No reply. No angry phone call. No wounded plea. Just a vast, echoing emptiness that was, in its own way, a more profound condemnation than any words could ever be. David felt it as a low-frequency hum of dread beneath the surface of his day, a constant reminder of the line he had just crossed. The inciting incident was not merely a text message. It was a calculated act of social surgery, meticulously planned and executed by Jessica. The dinner was the centerpiece of a campaign she had been waging for months. The target was General Magnus Thompson, the legendary retired four-star general, who was now the formidable CEO of Sterling Global Infrastructure, a titan of industry. Thompson was old school, a man known for his integrity, his sharp mind, and his utter intolerance for foolishness. Landing the Sterling contract for the city's new waterfront development project would not just make David's career, it would catapult him into the stratosphere of the corporate world. Jessica had researched Thompson exhaustively. She knew his military history, his business philosophy, his philanthropic interests, even his preferred brand of scotch. She had orchestrated this dinner at Aria, a restaurant so exclusive that reservations were a form of currency. The guest list was a strategic masterpiece, a city councilwoman, a prominent architect, and David and herself. Every detail was calibrated for maximum impact, to present David as a man of substance, vision, and impeccable taste. Arthur was the one variable she could not control, the one element that, in her mind, clashed violently with the curated perfection of the evening. The argument had been the culmination of weeks of subtle digs and pointed remarks. "We have to have him over soon, David," she would say. "Maybe for a casual barbecue. Not for, something important." The condescension was always wrapped in a veneer of feigned concern. "I just worry he'll feel out of place." The final confrontation had happened the night before. "Absolutely not," Jessica had said, her voice stripped of all pretense. "David, listen to me. Thompson is a man who values strength. Polish. He looks for command presence. What is he going to think when he sees your father, with his limp and his 20-year-old sports coat, sitting there saying nothing? It makes you look weak. It makes it look like you're still a little boy who has to bring his dad everywhere." The words were a direct hit on David's deepest insecurities. He saw the logic in them, or rather, he chose to. He allowed her ambition to become a lens through which he viewed his own father, distorting the image from one of quiet dignity to one of pitiable inadequacy. The rising action began in the wake of the text message. It was in the gnawing silence that followed. David checked his phone a dozen times, then 100. He expected something. Anger. Sadness. A simple wounded okay. But there was nothing. The lack of response was a blank canvas onto which David projected his own guilt. He imagined his father, alone in that quiet house, the hurt settling deep into his bones. The silence was an accusation, and it began to work on him. He became irritable and distracted at work. During a board meeting, he found his mind drifting, picturing his father in the garden, his hands plunged into the cool earth. He remembered a time as a boy when he had fallen and scraped his knee badly. He had been crying, terrified of the blood. His father had knelt, not coddling him, but speaking in a low, calm voice. "Breathe," he had said. "Just breathe. Look at the wound. Understand it. Then we fix it." He had cleaned the wound with a steady, practiced hand, his touch gentle but firm. Where had that man gone? Or had he been there all along, and David had just stopped seeing him? The observer in him was stirring, nudged from its slumber by the sharp poke of his own conscience. He started to recall other instances of Jessica's casual cruelty. The time she'd forgotten to invite Arthur to their housewarming party, claiming she'd lost his number. The Christmas she had given him an expensive but utterly impersonal cashmere scarf, a gift that screamed, "I don't know you at all." Each memory was a small, sharp stone, and they were beginning to form a heavy pile in the pit of his stomach. The climax of this rising action came in a phone call with his mother-in-law, Jessica's mother, a woman cut from the same cloth of social ambition. "Jessica told me you're finally having the dinner without a chaperone," she'd said, her voice dripping with approval. "It's for the best, David. To get to the next level, sometimes you have to travel light." Travel light. The phrase echoed in David's head. His father, reduced to baggage. The call solidified it. He was on the wrong side. He was complicit in something ugly and dishonorable. But the dinner was tonight. The gears were in motion. He felt trapped, a passenger in a car he had helped to start, speeding towards a cliff. The stakes were no longer just about a contract. They were about his own soul. The hours leading up to the dinner were a torment for David. The silence from his father had grown from a quiet hum of guilt into a roaring void. It was an active, oppressive force. For Arthur, however, the day unfolded with its usual, unhurried grace, a quiet rebellion against the storm of emotion he was expected to feel. He did not sit and brood. He did not curse his son or his son's wife. He finished fixing the neighbor's rocking chair, the rhythmic work of his hands a form of meditation. He sanded the wood, glued the spindle, clamped it with a practiced, gentle pressure. He made something broken whole again. He then took a long walk, his limp a steady, percussive beat on the pavement. He didn't walk towards his son's opulent downtown neighborhood. He walked towards the old part of town, towards the quiet cemetery where Eleanor was buried. He stood before the simple granite headstone, the grass around it neatly trimmed. He didn't speak. He just stood, a silent communion with the one person who had seen all of him, the warrior and the gardener, and had understood they were the same man. He brushed a stray leaf from her name. The narrative flashes back not to battles, but to small moments of Jessica's escalating disrespect, seen through a new, clearer lens. A family barbecue 2 summers ago. Arthur had been telling a story, a simple, amusing anecdote about a stubborn raccoon in his garden. Jessica had cut him off mid-sentence, turning to a more important guest to ask about their trip to Tuscany, leaving Arthur's words to hang in the air and wither. A birthday phone call, where Jessica had put him on speakerphone in a crowded room, her laughter at his simple well-wishes feeling like a performance for her friends. "Isn't he sweet?" she'd said, her tone dripping with the kind of condescension one reserves for a precocious child. These were not overt acts of war, but a campaign of 1,000 paper cuts, each one designed to diminish him, to quietly edit him out of the family portrait. And David, the observer, had stood by and let it happen. He had mistaken his silence for peacekeeping, when in reality, it was surrender. He had chosen the path of least resistance, and that path had led him here, to this moment of profound shame. The observer within David was now fully awake and screaming. As he put on his expensive, tailored suit, he didn't see a man on the cusp of greatness. He saw a fraud. The suit felt like a costume. The reflection in the mirror was of a stranger, a weak man who had traded his father's honor for a shot at a contract. The image of his father's hands, calloused, strong, honest, was superimposed in his mind over his own soft, manicured ones. One set of hands built and repaired, the other signed papers and typed text messages. The contrast was a physical blow. He thought about calling his father, of trying to undo the damage. But what could he say? The words of apology felt hollow and insufficient. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him, that he would have to do more than speak. He would have to act. But how? He was caught in the machine of Jessica's ambition, a gear turning in a mechanism he no longer believed in. The drive to the restaurant was silent and tense. Jessica was a coiled spring of excitement and focus, going over her talking points, rehearsing her witty anecdotes. David was a ghost beside her, his mind miles away, in a small, quiet house on a tree-lined street, with a man who was facing the evening alone because his own son hadn't had the courage to stand up for him. The lack of response from Arthur was the ultimate power move, though it was not intended as such. It was simply the truth of his character. He would not beg for a seat at a table where he was not wanted. He would not fight for a love that had to be demanded. His dignity was not a thing to be debated. It was absolute. It was this absolute, quiet strength that was now tearing David apart. He was beginning to understand. His father wasn't weak or simple. He was strong in a way David couldn't comprehend, a strength forged in crucibles David had only read about in history books. The son was finally starting to see the father. The restaurant, Aria, was exactly as Jessica had imagined, a temple of minimalist opulence. It was a world of hushed tones, gleaming surfaces, and the soft clinking of expensive crystal. The air itself seemed filtered, rarefied, smelling of money and expensive perfume. Jessica moved through it like a native, her smile bright and confident, her handshake firm. David followed in her wake, feeling like an imposter. His suit felt tight, his collar restrictive. He smiled, he nodded, he shook the hands of the councilwoman and the architect, but his heart was a lead weight in his chest. He was performing a role, and the script felt alien in his mouth. Then, General Magnus Thompson arrived. He didn't just enter the room, he took command of it. He was a man in his late 60s, tall and trim in an impeccably tailored suit, but there was nothing soft about him. His eyes, a pale, piercing blue, seemed to see everything. They held a weight, an authority that had nothing to do with his corporate title, and everything to do with a life lived at the sharp end of consequence. He moved with an economy of motion, a stillness that was more intimidating than any bluster. The handshake was brief, his grip like iron. "Jensen," he said, his voice a low baritone. "Good of you to arrange this." The conversation began, stilted and cautious. Jessica launched into her well-rehearsed charm offensive, complimenting the general on a recent article, asking insightful questions about his company's philanthropic arm. The architect discussed sustainable design. The councilwoman spoke of urban renewal. It was a dance of influence, a carefully choreographed ballet of egos. David tried to participate, speaking about market projections and logistical efficiencies, but his words felt hollow, a recitation of facts devoid of passion. He kept glancing at the empty chair at the table, a phantom presence that was more real to him than anyone sitting there. He imagined his father in that chair, his quiet presence a silent rebuke to all this polished artifice. General Thompson was polite but distant. He listened more than he spoke, his gaze sweeping over each person at the table, a quiet, constant assessment. He seemed unimpressed by Jessica's flattery, unmoved by the architect's jargon. There was a moment when Jessica, in an attempt at humor, said, "Honestly, getting this waterfront project off the ground has been a military campaign in itself." Thompson didn't smile. A flicker of something cold and hard passed through his eyes. "Ma'am," he said, his voice flat, "I assure you it has not." The rebuke was subtle, but it landed with the force of a physical slap. The temperature at the table dropped 10 degrees. Jessica's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. It was in that moment that David knew they were failing. Thompson was not a man who could be schmoozed. He was a man who dealt in substance, not style, and they were offering him nothing but froth. The tension thickened, a palpable entity in the air. The food, a parade of exquisitely arranged but minuscule dishes, arrived and was eaten with little comment. The wine was poured. The small talk sputtered and died. David felt a bead of sweat trickle down his back. This was a disaster. All the planning, all the sacrifice, the terrible text message, it was all for nothing. He had sold a piece of his soul for a seat at this table, and the meal was turning to ashes in his mouth. The narrator's voice reflects on the scene, contrasting the cold, sterile ambition of the restaurant with the warm, living earth of Arthur's garden. It speaks of two different kinds of value, the kind that is listed on a stock exchange, and the kind that is earned in silence and sacrifice. One is loud, demanding attention. The other is quiet, asking for nothing. And in that silent, expensive room, the loud, hollow world of David and Jessica was about to collide with the quiet, unshakable reality of Arthur Jensen. The collision would not be loud. It would be a quiet, devastating implosion. The turning point, the moment the entire artifice of the evening began to fracture, came from an unexpected direction. General Thompson, having endured the vapid conversation with stoic patience, leaned back in his chair, a thoughtful, distant look in his piercing blue eyes. He swirled the amber liquid in his glass. "You know," he said, his voice quiet but carrying an immense weight that instantly commanded the table's absolute attention, "all this talk of building, of structures, of logistics, it reminds me of my time in the service. The most brilliant engineer I ever met wasn't some MIT graduate with a fancy degree. He was a sergeant. A quiet man. Hardly said two words." Jessica, seeing an opening to connect, leaned forward. "Oh, the military is such a wonderful training ground for practical skills." Thompson's eyes flickered towards her, and for a moment, the coldness was back. He ignored her comment, his gaze fixed on a point in the middle distance, a point 30 years in the past. "We were in a real hellhole," he continued, his voice low and gravelly, like stones grinding together. "A place that's just a name on a map now. We called the operation Whisper Bridge. Our platoon was cut off, pinned down in a river valley, taking heavy fire. The only way out was across a deep, fast-moving gorge. The combat engineers said it was impossible. A week's work, they said. We had hours." The table was silent. This was not a pre-rehearsed anecdote. This was real. The air crackled with the sudden intrusion of genuine, life-and-death gravity. David found himself leaning in, captivated. "But this sergeant," Thompson said, a note of profound reverence entering his voice, "he just looked at the gorge, looked at the pile of scrap we had, some wrecked vehicles, some loose timber, and he said, 'I can do it.' No fanfare. No fuss. Just that. I can do it." Thompson took a slow sip of his scotch. "We called him the architect. He could see things no one else could. He saw the geometry in chaos. For 6 hours, under constant sniper fire, he orchestrated a miracle. He had us lashing things together with comms wire, using techniques I'd never seen. He had a specific way of tying a tension knot, a kind of double-loop cinch. It was his signature. A jolt went through David, an electric shock that seemed to stop his heart. The double-loop cinch knot. He'd seen that knot 1,000 times. On the trellis for the climbing roses in the garden. On the rope swing his father had built for him as a boy. On the tarpaulin covering the woodpile. It was his father's knot. A small, insignificant detail from his childhood, suddenly illuminated with a terrifying, brilliant light. The camera of the mind would smash cut. Thompson's reverent description, then a sun-drenched memory of a 10-year-old David watching his father's hands, those strong, calloused hands, effortlessly tying that exact, peculiar knot. His father, patient and quiet, explaining, "This one holds. It won't slip." David's blood ran cold. The room seemed to tilt on its axis. He looked at Thompson, then at the empty chair, and a monstrous, impossible idea began to form in his mind. It couldn't be. His father. The quiet man who fixed lawnmowers. The man Jessica called gray and boring. It was impossible. But the knot was real. His mind raced, connecting disparate, forgotten memories. The way his father could look at a broken engine and diagnose it just by the sound. The strange, assessing stillness that came over him in a crisis. The deep, bone-weary sadness that sometimes settled in his eyes, which David had always mistaken for loneliness. He was seeing the pieces of his father for the first time, not as random, unremarkable traits, but as parts of a whole, a man he didn't know at all. The observer was no longer just observing, he was understanding. And the understanding was a devastating wave of revelation. The air at the table was thick with a new kind of tension. It was no longer the awkwardness of a failing business dinner, but the heavy, charged silence that precedes a lightning strike. General Thompson, lost in his recollection, seemed unaware of the turmoil he had ignited in David. He continued, his voice a low, reverent rumble. "This man, this sergeant, he wasn't just an engineer. He was a leader. Not with shouting, but with silence. With competence. Men who were terrified, who were ready to break. They saw him working, saw that calm, and they found their own courage. They would have followed him into the gates of hell. That night, I believe they did. Thompson paused, setting his glass down with a soft, definitive click. He looked directly at David, his blue eyes seeming to search for something. I've spent the last 30 years trying to find him. After that night, he was wounded, sent home. He refused the commendations, refused the promotions. He just vanished. Wanted no part of the recognition. I owe that man my life, and the lives of 30 other men. It was then that Thompson reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his wallet. From a worn sleeve, he carefully extracted a faded, creased black and white photograph. It was dog-eared and softened by decades of handling. He slid it across the polished table. "That's him," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "That's the hero of Whisper Bridge." The photograph slid to a stop in the center of the table. It showed a group of young, exhausted, grime-covered soldiers in a desert landscape. They were hollow-eyed but alive. And in the center of the group, looking not at the camera but at something just beyond it, was a young man. His face was lean and hard, his eyes holding a shocking intensity, but it was unmistakably, unequivocally him. It was a young Arthur Jensen. David felt the air leave his lungs in a silent gasp. The world dissolved into a roaring in his ears. It was him. It was his father. Not the gentle, stooped man who grew roses, but this warrior. This legend. Jessica stared at the photo, her mouth slightly agape. The color drained from her face. The condescending smirk she sometimes wore when talking about Arthur was gone, replaced by a mask of pure, uncomprehending shock. Her mind, so quick and calculating, simply could not process this new data. Arthur Jensen, the social liability, was the hero of this powerful man's story. The foundation of her world, built on status and appearance, crumbled to dust in that single, silent moment. And then, the general delivered the final, devastating monologue. "His name," Thompson said, his voice now clear and strong, filled with the authority of a 4-star general delivering a citation, "is Sergeant Arthur Jensen. They called him the architect. He held the line when no one else could. He built a bridge out of courage and scrap metal. He carried his wounded captain, me, 2 miles on his back under machine gun fire after a piece of shrapnel from a mortar round nearly severed his leg." He pointed a finger at the photo, at the young Arthur. "That man is the reason I have a life, a family, a company. Everything I am, I owe to the quiet, stubborn courage of the man in that picture. He is, without exaggeration, the finest soldier and the most honorable man I have ever known." He then looked around the table, his gaze finally settling on David, who was now pale and trembling, his eyes locked on the face of his young father in the photograph. The connection was made. The shared last name. The dawning horror on David's face. Thompson's expression shifted from reverence to a sharp, penetrating inquiry. "Jensen," he said, the name now an accusation. "Arthur Jensen. Is he any relation to you?" David looked up from the photo, his eyes swimming with tears. He tried to speak, but his throat was constricted with a knot of guilt so profound it was a physical thing. He could only nod, a single jerky motion. He finally found his voice, a choked, broken whisper that was barely audible in the tomb-like silence of the restaurant. "He's my father." The 3 words hung in the air, heavy and indivisible. "He's my father." They were a confession, a revelation, and a judgment all at once. The silence that followed was not empty. It was filled with the deafening sound of a world being irrevocably altered. It was the silence of shame. It was the silence of awe. It was the silence of a truth, long buried, finally breaking the surface with the force of an earthquake. Jessica was frozen, a statue of disbelief. Her perfectly constructed persona had shattered. The confident, articulate social climber was gone, replaced by a woman staring at the wreckage of her own shallow judgments. The man she had dismissed, mocked, and excluded was not just a relic. He was a titan, a hero in the eyes of the very man she had been so desperate to impress. The irony was so crushing, so complete, it was almost poetic. She had cast out the king, believing him to be a peasant. She looked at her husband, David, and saw not the successful partner she admired, but a man drowning in a sea of his own making, his face a mask of anguish and regret. There was no recovery from this. No witty remark or clever deflection could patch this gaping wound. She had been weighed, measured, and found wanting, not by the general, but by her own profound ignorance. David felt as if he were outside his own body, watching the scene unfold. The face of the young warrior in the photo merged with the face of his gentle father in the garden. The limp, the calloused hands, the quiet eyes, the double-loop knot, it all coalesced into a single, blazing image of a man he had lived with his entire life but had never truly seen. The weight of his betrayal was a physical pressure, crushing the air from his lungs. The text message, "My wife doesn't want you there. I can't risk it." The words echoed in his mind, now revealed in their full, horrific cowardice. He hadn't been protecting his career. He had been sacrificing his father's honor for it. He had traded gold for dust. General Thompson's eyes, those piercing blue lasers, bored into David. The reverence he had held for the architect had now transformed into a cold, quiet contempt for the son. He saw it all in an instant, the son's shame, the wife's shocked arrogance, the empty chair at the table. He understood the evening's unspoken subtext. He knew, with the certainty of a commander reading a battlefield, that Arthur Jensen had been deliberately excluded. "He's your father," Thompson repeated, his voice dangerously soft. He looked from David to Jessica, and then at the empty chair. He didn't need to say another word. His gaze was the verdict. The dinner was over. The contract was lost. But that was nothing. What was lost was so much more significant. Thompson slowly, deliberately, picked up the faded photograph from the table. He slid it back into his wallet with the care one affords a sacred relic. He then stood up, his tall frame commanding the space. The councilwoman and the architect, sensing the cataclysm that had occurred, remained utterly still. "Well, Jensen," Thompson said, his voice flat and hard as granite. He was no longer speaking to a potential business partner. He was speaking to the son of a man he revered, a son he had found unworthy. It was an informative evening. He let the words hang in the air. Then he added one final, devastating instruction. "If you see your father," he said, the steel in his voice now absolute, "you tell him Magnus Thompson is looking for him. Tell him I've never stopped looking. And you tell him he owes me a coffee. We have 30 years to catch up on." Without another glance, he turned and walked away. His footsteps on the marble floor were the only sound, each one a hammer blow on the coffin of David and Jessica's ambitions. They were left alone at the table, surrounded by the ruins of their perfectly planned evening, two small, shame-faced people in a vast, silent room. The expensive food was tasteless, the fine wine sour. The beautiful view from the window seemed to mock them with its serene indifference. The silence stretched, and in it, David knew what he had to do. David didn't wait for the bill. He didn't look at Jessica. He pushed his chair back, the scraping sound unnaturally loud in the funereal silence, and walked out of the restaurant. He didn't run, but every step was filled with a desperate, urgent purpose. He was a man racing to reclaim a part of himself he had just discovered was missing. He got into his car, the leather and polished wood of the luxury sedan feeling cheap and insulting. He drove, not with the aggressive speed of an angry man, but with the focused intensity of a medic rushing to a casualty. He drove away from the glittering, hollow towers of downtown, towards the quiet, tree-lined streets of his childhood. He drove towards his father's house. As he turned onto the familiar street, a wave of memories washed over him. Playing catch in the front yard. His father pushing him on the swing, his strong hands a promise of safety. Learning to drive in the family's old, reliable sedan, his father's calm voice a steady presence beside him. How had he forgotten? How had he allowed the noise of his new life to drown out the fundamental truths of his old one? The house was dark, save for a single, soft yellow light on the back porch. David parked the car and walked up the familiar path, his expensive shoes feeling clumsy and loud on the cracked concrete. He went around to the back, and there he was. Arthur Jensen was sitting on the top step of the porch, the same step where he had taught David to tie his shoes. He was looking up at the vast, star-dusted canvas of the night sky. He wasn't brooding. He wasn't sad. He was just present. He seemed as much a part of the quiet night as the old oak tree and the sleeping roses. He heard David approach and turned his head slowly. He saw the look on his son's face, the tears, the raw, open wound of guilt, and his expression didn't change. There was no "I told you so." No anger. Only a deep, quiet knowing. David stopped at the bottom of the steps, unable to go further. "Dad," he began, his voice breaking. The word was a prayer, an apology, a plea. "Dad, I'm so sorry." The words were inadequate, flimsy nets trying to capture an ocean of regret. He sank to his knees on the cool grass, the sobs he had been holding back finally breaking free. He cried for his own weakness, for his blindness, for the years of casual disrespect he had allowed. He cried for the hero he had never known. Arthur watched him for a long moment. He didn't rush to comfort him. He let the storm break. He let the poison of guilt come out. Then he slowly rose, his limp more pronounced in his weariness, and descended the steps. He stood before his weeping son, and did the one thing David hadn't expected. He placed a heavy, calloused hand on David's shoulder. The touch was not one of forgiveness, not yet. It was one of grounding. It was a simple, powerful acknowledgement. This is real. We are here. Now. David looked up, his face stained with tears. He was there, David whispered. General Thompson. He told me everything. Arthur's gaze drifted back towards the night sky, towards a past that was always with him. A faint, sad smile touched his lips. It was not a smile of vindication. It was a smile of relief, of a burden finally shared. He thought of the young, terrified captain he had carried on his back. Magnus, Arthur said, the name a soft echo from another world. He looked down at his son, his eyes clear and deep. He didn't say, I forgive you. He didn't say it's okay. He said something far more profound. He made it. 3 simple words. They were not about the dinner, or the contract, or the apology. They were about a promise kept across 30 years of silence. Magnus Thompson had survived. He had lived a full life. That was the only victory that had ever mattered. The lesson was complete. Honor wasn't about being recognized. It was about being worthy of recognition. The narrator's voice closes the story, reflecting on the nature of quiet heroism. It speaks of the fathers and mothers, the neighbors and strangers, who carry the weight of incredible histories in silence. They ask for nothing, but they are the pillars that hold the world up. David had a long road ahead, a journey to earn back the trust he had broken, and to become a man worthy of being Arthur Jensen's son. But for the first time in a long time, he was on the right path. The journey would not be easy, but it would be real. What does true strength look like? Is it found in the boardroom or in the quiet dignity of a man tending his garden? Tell us your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story reminded you that heroes are all around us, often in the last places we think to look, please subscribe to our channel and join a community that celebrates the stories that truly matter.